And then I do a lot of speaking and writing, and because PM Press is here, and they also have a table, I have a book that I'm collaboratively putting out with someone else called Paths Toward Utopia, which I stole the title of for this, but the book's not quite ready, so I'm very excited, ready for it to be done. And I guess the reason I pointed to both those projects and books to begin with is those are both things that I'll never really make any money off of, and is not the point of them. And what's been more interesting to me about writing or any kind of project that you're trying to kind of use ideas to get out politically is, for me, this idea of creating a collaborative sort of space of commons where people use the projects they're doing to exemplify a different way of doing them in the thing itself, which I'm always curious of whether that translates to the thing itself. So the reason Paths Toward Utopia, why I really chose that for this, and like the title and what this collaborative project that I was involved in has been trying to do, is how to people, through the process of making something themselves and creating a space that's different than the spaces we're given, through things like capitalism or heteronormativity or a whole bunch of other things, the state, any other relationship that's not ours, that's given to us and that we are forced to sort of follow the logic of. How do we think about a way to move out of that that's our own? So how do we walk toward a utopia that isn't some fixed endpoint, but is actually the process of the path, which, you know, if you end up looking at this project, for me, the project I'm really excited about, the book project, but the path toward doing that book was a process of two of us, a third person designing, struggling to figure out the difficulties of thinking, what do we do in the present that we can think of as extending toward, pointing toward a different world? So how do we get from here to more and more closer approximations of freedom or non-hierarchy or a non-heteronormative world, a world that's ours from below? How do we do that from the things we have right now, the material stuff in our midst? And one thing that's been intriguing to me about this historical moment, so many things, I can barely sleep, for the past 8 months. It's too exciting to sleep right now. But there's this interesting, I think, implicit assertion, which is why I, again, use a subtitle for this session on the commons. Whether people understand it or not, I really find it really interesting that there's sort of this historical zeitgeist, which has been happening for maybe 15 or so years, of people, you know, demanding a world from below, or horizontalism, or self-organization, or all the different words that people have been using to describe the same thing, which is this assertion, I think, of a space of commons, which I will explain. And then I'd actually like, depending on how much time we have, to maybe talk for 15 or 20 minutes, and then maybe have a discussion about how do we actually, what examples are there of commons, or what are strategies toward getting there. So I will, sorry, I'm going to jump back and forth between hectic notes. Okay, all right. So, yeah. So there's all these movements, whether it's Occupy or, you know, starting with Tunisia and Tahrir, and a whole bunch of movements that we can date over the past, Spain, which, you know, for those of you, the anniversary of that just happened with the assembly structure, where there was, again, people taking over plazas all over Spain recently, to what's happening now in Montreal and Quebec, where people are asserting a different way of understanding how they want their world to look like. And again, I really want to point to this as, whether I'm right or not, I'm going to make an argument that the underlying assertion in all these, that binds these struggles together, I know right now people are talking about it as what binds them together is an anti-austerity cry. And I prefer to also look at, again, the path toward utopia. What's the prefigurative impulse? What are people not asking against, struggling against, but what are they moving toward? So that's why I want to look at the commons. Can everyone hear me? Because the acoustics feel really bad. Okay, I'm feeling like I can barely hear myself. Okay, so I'm going to start off with a quote from John Holloway in a book called Crack Capitalism, where many people have done work around the commons, and I really want to point you toward the work of Midnight Notes Collective, although they're not going under that name, but Sylvia Federici or George Caventis or Peter Leinbau, or people that have done a lot of work. There's a lot of people that have done a lot of work around the concept of the commons, so I'm not inventing this. And those people aren't inventing it either. They're actually looking at lived practices. But John Holloway's work has really spoken to me lately, and I'm going to read this little quote of his from the book Crack Capitalism. where he says, he's defining the commons. The commons can be seen as the embryonic form of a new society. Okay, now he's quoting Marx. If the cell form of capitalism is the commodity, the cellular form of a society beyond capital is the commons. And back to John Holloway. If capital is a movement of enclosing, the commons are a disjointed commoning, a moving in the opposite direction, a refusure of enclosure. And how he understands enclosure, I'm going to read one more Holloway quote, is an enclosure is an appropriation or a separating of something from the common, from our own common enjoyment or use. So we can understand enclosure in a sense, is closing off anything, privatizing, making something separate from what people, all of us, have access to. And that kind of enclosure can happen with, we think of traditionally, Marx, when he was talking about asserting the commons against the commodity, was a shift. The kind of classic example is the Enclosures Acts and the rise of the Industrial Revolution, when people had fields they just used in common, they shared to graze sheep, and they had to figure out how those sheep could use that space so that they could all use it and share it. And with the rise of industrial capitalism, fences were literally enclosed off land and didn't allow people to use those spaces, compelling people to then go into factories to make wages for their time, and shifted a whole bunch of understanding about how people, economics, that's kind of the classic example of very, literal enclosure of a fence around something. But what I really appreciate about Marx's work is that capitalism, no matter how small it is, and that's why I like this quote from the beginning of Capital, the book, when Marx talks about capitalism as a cell form, as the commodity, is that it's a little tiny cell, and no matter how small you get it back down to, it just grows again, and it starts enclosing. So now enclosure extends to pretty much everything. Politics, caring, the ecosystem, knowledge, information, our bodies, politics. We can think of almost everything in a sense that, especially this historical moment, as being closed off from us. Okay, so how Holloway and how I and other people have understood the commons, to kind of come back to maybe a clearer definition, is something that's held in common, which makes sense, common sense, but it is held in common to be used, shared, and enjoyed by all of us. Used, shared, and enjoyed. Kind of nice, warm, fuzzy, again, common sense things. We have a space, here we are using, sharing, and enjoying this 2640 for the weekend. Right. And what's nice about this using, sharing, and enjoying is that usage doesn't diminish its worth for all of us, but it actually increases it. Okay. So its worth is not determined by money or exchange value, but it's actually by how useful it is to all of us in our community, and that it grows through that. I've been thinking of someone I know is writing an anthology about revolutionary love, and so I was thinking a lot about that category lately. And love is such a good example of that, is the more you love and are loved in a very expansive, lovely way, which is one thing Occupy has really captured. I was really struck by how many people had hearts and love, and it didn't mean anything the first few weeks other than sort of symbols, but through the hard process of a path toward utopia that was difficult and messy and complicated and hard, people really forged really deep relationships through these grand historical moments, and they start really having this expansive love for each other and humanity and specific individuals, and in a way that the love that's brought into these common spaces makes it more. Right? It doesn't have a value. It becomes a friend I was just hanging out with the other night said his idea of moving toward this sort of different world was moving from a world that's priced to one that's priceless, which I thought was an interesting way to think about it too. So it expands how we think about it. Okay. So if that's true, that it's commons are something that we use, share, and enjoy together, thus we all have a completely equal interest in sustaining that space. Right? Because if one of us destroys it or misuses it or keeps it for ourselves, then the rest of us can't use it and share it and enjoy it together. So I want to read another quote from a book called Paths in Utopia, which I start out by calling this Paths Toward Utopia, and I really am hearkening toward this book, which doesn't get read enough, by a now long dead anarchistic Jewish radical named Martin Buber. And it's a nice book about thinking about how we move toward utopia. And he talks about the commons as the real living together of man with man can only thrive where people have the real things of their common life in common. That's another nice way to think about it. The real things of our life together are our own commons. So, but to me what's been interesting about this historical moment is using, sharing, and enjoying can still happen within, like this space. We're using, sharing, and enjoying it completely coexistent within capitalism. They rent this space. You know, church uses all these different institutions that we may or may not feel good about. I don't know about the church. Might be a great church. I don't mean to critique the congregation here. Don't even know what they do. But there's a way in which this isn't antagonistic. This space particularly, it's right, our use and enjoyment. So the implicit and essential corollary to a commons, which is inherent, I think, in every commons, is if we all want to be able to use, share, and enjoy it, we all have to have the ability to self-manage and self-govern it. We all have to have the ability to share and sustain and how it's going to be used, shared, and enjoyed, or it has no meaning, really. Right? And it also has no sort of antagonism that starts pointing toward a different world that leads us beyond. So whether that's informal or formal, we need mechanisms for figuring out how to self-manage and self-organize and self-govern our spaces and self-determine ourselves. I really like the word self in front of things. And also actually even self-discipline. I really like lately. I've been thinking a lot about that. I've been fortunate to be in Montreal for about 8 or 9. I just literally came down from there. And it was really interesting to me when you have tens of thousands, 50,000, 500,000 people in the street with it really is leaderless in a very lovely way, but people are acting in concert, and it's been really striking the self-discipline people have exerted time and time again at moments where you just think it's going to go careening off, and I have no idea how that happens, except that there really is a implicit sense of people understanding they're creating a commons, that they're self-governing and self-determining, even though it's very informal right now. It's really, actually, one of the really interesting phenomena to me there. Okay, so then we need to determine through that self-governance and self-management is what kind of uses, what kind of enjoyments, what kind of sharing. What are the parameters? So to come back to the sheep grazing on the pasture with the literal enclosure or before the literal enclosure, if you didn't figure out how much of the grass the sheep should eat and when and all the other stuff, is it grass? Someone can correct me because I also don't know what sheep eat. Whatever the grain is they were munching on, is that if you don't determine that, someone's group of sheep, flock of sheep could eat too much, or you could overgraze, so there's a way in which the self-determination, self-management creates our own sense of boundaries, which is really different than enclosures. Like a promise to each other to sustain it, right? If we deplete the air space right now, the big contest over, who's going to control the climate, what is happening with climate change is a sense of, our use of that is going to affect us all, right? We destroy the climate, we're all going to be destroyed. Okay. So the sense of, to come back to enclosure, when things at this historical moment enclose things, I really want to point to that enclosure now is well beyond mere material sustenance, although that's completely key at this historical moment, especially in the United States. So we see enclosures of things like education and healthcare and food, where increasingly people have less and less access to those things, right? Or no access at all. But it also really closes off possibility, and it especially closes off our ability to have power together, all right? So this historical moment, again, all these movements that have been happening in this past year and a half, like most movements that are sort of from below and rising up from people to reclaim their spaces, reclaim their cities, reclaim their workspaces, are about people also opening up possibility, which is actually as important as opening up, unenclosing things we really need to live. I really come back to that Martin Buber quote. We need everything together in common to have our common lives, and that isn't just food things, information, again, the natural world, etc. Someone else, another anarchist the other day was using this example who's really interested in ecological issues, and he talked about how when we think about trees right now, and I thought this was really interesting in a city. I was in Montreal, and it's like here, there's a lot of trees, but it's a very green city in terms of there's foodstuffs growing all over the city. And he was talking about the tree outside his house, and he goes, we look at that tree and we think, oh, it's enclosed off by grates, the sidewalk wraps around it on this urban street, and we think someone owns that tree, and we see the little square, and probably just walk by a bunch outside where in cities, sidewalks surround trees. And we look at the way it's enclosed in the sidewalk, and we think ownership and bounded, and it's separate from us. And he goes, and what's interesting about a tree is that a tree the bulk of what happens with the tree is that a bird flies into it, and the sun nourishes it, and we look at it, and it's enjoyable, and maybe there's some fruit hanging off, but we pick it off the tree. And there's all these ways in which the bulk of the use of that tree, which when we visually look at seems enclosed on our city streets, is actually unenclosed in most of the ways, but we see it the opposite way. So I really want to point to how our minds close off the possibility that's already there. I thought that tree was such a lovely example. Now I'm walking down the street saying, no, the trees are actually mostly unenclosed, even though they look like they're enclosed to us. And that's mostly how structures make us feel like things aren't ours. So what I want to try to wrap up in about 5 minutes. So what I think is really wonderful about this historical moment is, again, I really want to say it's to some degree been almost intuitive or implicit, and I hope it can become more and more explicit, is that people have really been coming to spaces in this historical moment when they're contesting things that are either in one of two categories. Either spaces that are privatized, clearly privatized, that we know are privately owned. Zuccotti Plaza was an interesting example. It is privately owned by a very large, very wealthy corporate entity. So it's a space that people took over to try to make into a commons, or didn't even know they were doing it when they first did it. But it's a highly privatized space in a highly privatized city, right? I mean, New York, probably one of the premier examples of ultra-privatization of space. But the second place that people have been really taking over is spaces that we think of as public. And most of us, I think, have thought of public as somehow us, right? So, but increasingly public has almost no meaning if we come back to what I was talking about, the commons. It's not just that we use, share, and enjoy it, but we have to be able to self-determine and self-govern and self-manage it. And so for the time I was doing Occupy, I was in Philly, and we took over the municipal public plaza around City Hall, which was completely controlled by a hierarchical mayor, police forces, Homeland Security set up a big truck on it. All these other ways in which a developer is redoing the plaza right now. All these other ways in which the public space is completely not ours, right? Public libraries, my favorite example of like thinking about how we move to here to there. Libraries begin to already have the values we want. I think most of us recognize libraries as something that seemed like we could extend to a different world. But public in libraries basically means you can't sleep there if you're not, reading long enough in a lot of places, or you can't do a lot of things people need to maybe do. In a lot of big cities, people need to use bathrooms because they don't have places to live, and a lot of public libraries increasingly say, don't do this, this, this. I was just in I can't remember where, a big public library, and in the bathroom it had a sign this long of things you couldn't do in the space that's public, right? So these two kind of grand things in our world right now, either highly privatized spaces, which are policed and held from powers from below and closed off, or public spaces which largely function the same way. Parks that close at a certain time, even though there's no physical gate around them, right? So almost all the movements right now have been coming to spaces that we understand mostly as public. To here, or Madison, Wisconsin, the Capitol building, which people took over, was supposed to be 24 hours a day, a public space that people could be in any time they wanted to. And when people actually just said, okay, we're here, we don't want to leave, and we're here, and we need food, and we need to sleep, and we need childcare, and we need art. And then they're like, oh, no, we didn't mean it was that public space. No, you've got to leave. And so there's this really interesting, again, moment in which we're trying to find what is actually commons again, and trying to begin to practice it in these spaces. Because when we're in these spaces that we make into commons, we have to figure out how to feed each other and do healthcare and do art and make decisions. And we have to begin to practice this common usage of it. But it's really perplexing to me to think about what spaces actually are common anymore in that way. Even in our minds again, I really want to point to that tree example. That really shook me up just even thinking about that, is how you think, oh, I get it. And then you realize how much of our world we structure around thinking through how closed off it is to us, even though it isn't. Another anarchist friend of mine, and I haven't had time to watch it, was talking about a struggle in Ireland where his grandfather was involved and they had taken over a neighborhood, and I can't remember the name of it, rioted and gained control over the neighborhood, built big barricades around their neighborhood. And he said everyone was making Molotov cocktails, and they created an assembly line of Molotov cocktails. The older people who knew how to make it better were telling the younger folks to get out of the way. And so I really want to watch this. I think can't remember the name, if anyone knows the neighborhood. Anyway. But he said at some point they had such control of making their neighborhood their own commons that they removed the barricade and do a chalk line around their neighborhood, and the police stayed on the other side of it for a while until they lost that But that's remarkable that we can do those lines and have it be our own sense of parameters that we agree to do what we want to do in our common spaces. Okay. So I want to end with another Holloway quote. So let's see. He talks about the sense of the commons then as being the assertion against a world that treats us all as objects and that denies our capacity to determine our own lives, that we are the subjects capable and worthy of deciding for ourselves. I really like that. I'm going to read another quote. Sorry to be so quote heavy. I've been reading a lot of people that have inspired me lately. Another kind of related concept, which I won't really go into, is thinking about commons as gifts that we're giving to each other, these spaces where we're suddenly giving the world to each other. And there's a collective of Spanish feminists called Precarias a la Deriva, and I'm totally mispronouncing that because I don't speak Spanish. And they talk about the logic of the gift, which I think really mirrors an understanding of the commons. We want to think of relations beyond those of the commodity, following the logic of the gift, where one gives without knowing what, how, and when one will receive something in exchange, which I think is a nice echo into the commons. Okay. So, well, I actually managed to kind of get close to time. Okay. So I wanted to maybe have just a conversation. I really think it is perplexing to think about if there's this assertion of spaces. And to hear for 18 days when people first took it over, they literally created a city of their own within a city while they're under siege and trying to overthrow a dictatorial regime. What was most important to them was also equally important, was actually carving out this common space. What would a city in common look like inside a city that's not in common? And I always keep using this example because it really struck me in that is while they're battling tanks and being killed and everything is, people spent the time to worry about everything, including how to set up trash collection, but also recycling, which to me was mind-boggling because, like, who cares when you've got tanks rolling in that you're recycling? And there isn't even recycling in Cairo in general. So people thought that was important enough in 18 days to create a common space for their use, sharing, and enjoyment together that they self-determined that was an important thing. And like I said, I've been in Montreal this I went up for the Anarchist Book Fair and couldn't leave because it's amazing, and it's not directly transferable to here, but it's very inspirational. And a friend of mine there said the city has become ungovernable, and I thought what's really been, I think, really intriguing to me, and I was reflecting on it, coming down to do this, was that the ungovernability is that people are in this massive, massive, massive way of turning this city, which already feels very lovely if you've been to Montreal. The urban architecture is, there's the one architect designed this, but it was really intriguing that every living space in the bulk of the center city, from every apartment, has to have an exterior staircase. So instead of interior, the whole city faces exterior. So every single house has its own staircase outside, which means you have lots of staircases, and every one almost has little balconies. So it feels very public already. But there's a sense in which people, night after night, it's in night 39 tonight, there's been like 120 days of people on strike. For 39 days at night, it's phenomenal. At 8 p.m., you just go out and just people start pouring out of the streets and their balconies and their staircases and bus windows and car windows, and increasingly in all directions, and veering and finding each other and then going off and finding something else for hours until 1 or 2 in the morning, night after night. And it's to contest what's going on so we can see it as an but the police can't do anything. It's just remarkable. Traffic can't happen. Bridges accidentally get stopped because it takes an hour for people to walk down the street they've chosen to walk down. It's just really remarkable. But it's a space in which ungovernability is one aspect because the government can't keep up and who knows what will happen. But there's this other way of also looking at it where people are asserting this different sense of their own use, sharing, and enjoyment because it's beautiful and joyful. Everyone's face coming up to each other, everyone's just like, oh, and it's just, and every age group, little babies and kids all the way up, 30s, 40s, 50s, 80s, 90s. I walk by hospitals and places where people are, and people would just come out in their wheelchairs or, with their eye, and it's just such a remarkable moment when people are transforming a city into their own space and deciding in a very informal way how they want to move through the streets and create a protest movement right now together. But I really want to look at the opposite impulses, like what would it look like to have our cities become ours again? But the tricky question, and I'll end on a note of this, is it's really hard to know what to do with that, right? So even if we create commons, I was thinking about take back the land as another form of commons, where people take over houses and remove it from privatized property or public and start self-governing over our own housing. It still is in how do we do that so we create more and more of it and then it stays, right? Because that's the trick. And that's actually not an easy, I don't know what you do with these moments, right? Occupy's experiencing that wall right now. Like, so what do? You keep taking over these spaces, the police kick you out because they aren't even remotely commons, right? So even though that's what the cry is for what people are actually doing and demanding and coming back again and again and again, as sick as I am of people coming back to the same plazas to take them over, there's that impulse there again that it feels different to have spaces that are different even than this, right? Where we can determine together what they'll be like through assembly structures or all sorts of other informal mechanisms.